My name is Maya Ingram, and I'm 16 years old, which in a town like Northwood, Oregon, feels a lot like being a small fish in a very, very small pond. Northwood is the kind of place where the scent of pine needles and damp earth is always in the air, and the biggest event of the year is the county fair. Everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do. For me, life revolved around the rhythm of school bells and the quiet hum of my home life. My most interesting quality, the thing that set me apart from the endless sea of plaid shirts and hiking boots, was my love for cooking. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a connection. My grandmother, who passed away 2 years ago, was a magician in the kitchen. She left me her collection of worn, food-stained recipe books, and every time I opened one, it felt like she was standing right there with me, guiding my hands. Cooking was my sanctuary, the one place where I felt completely in control and completely myself. The high school, Northwood High, had a surprisingly decent culinary arts program, and I was its most devoted student. My teacher, Mr. Dubois, was a cheerful, round man who saw the passion in my eyes and always encouraged me. He let me experiment, to try the more complicated recipes from my grandmother's collection, even if they weren't strictly on the curriculum. That's how I found myself one Tuesday afternoon, carefully tending to a sheet of focaccia art bread in the school's industrial oven. It wasn't just bread, it was a canvas. I had spent hours kneading the dough, letting it rise to the perfect pillowy texture, and then studding it with cherry tomato flowers, bell pepper stems, and a sprinkle of rosemary that looked like tiny green leaves. It was my grandmother's recipe, a piece of my heart on a baking sheet. But the timer for the end of class buzzed before the bread was perfectly golden brown. Mr. Dubois, seeing the look of panic on my face, gave me a reassuring smile. He told me to leave it in the oven and that he would pull it out for me. I could just swing by his classroom after fifth period to pick it up. The rest of the afternoon felt like it was moving in slow motion. I couldn't focus in my math class, my mind constantly drifting back to that warm, fragrant bread. When the bell for the end of fifth period finally rang, I practically ran to the culinary arts room. The focaccia was resting on a cooling rack, looking even more beautiful than I had imagined. The crust was a perfect golden brown, and the vegetable art on top was vibrant and inviting. Mr. Dubois helped me wrap it loosely in plastic wrap on a sturdy paper plate, and I felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just food, it was an accomplishment. My next class, American History with Mr. Harrison, was on the other side of the school. I walked through the crowded hallways, holding my creation carefully, feeling the warmth from the plate seep into my hands. This is where my world, my quiet, predictable world, was about to be shaken. In my history class were two girls, Jessica and Brittany. They were the undisputed queens of the junior class social scene. Jessica was the leader, sharp and cutting with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Brittany was her shadow, echoing her laughs and amplifying her cruelty. They had never targeted me directly before, but I had seen their brand of casual meanness directed at others. They operated on the assumption that some people were beneath their notice, and I was apparently one of them. I slid into my desk near the back, placing the plate of focaccia carefully beside my textbook. The smell of garlic, rosemary, and warm bread filled the small space around me, and I smiled to myself. I couldn't wait to get home and share it with my parents. That's when I felt a presence beside my desk. I looked up to see Jessica leaning over, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling over her shoulder. Brittany stood just behind her, chewing her gum with a bored expression. Jessica's eyes were locked on the plate. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice laced with a kind of sweet poison. "I made it," I said simply, trying to focus on opening my textbook. "In my cooking class." Brittany snorted a little laugh. "No, seriously," Jessica pressed, ignoring my answer. "Did your mom make it for you? It smells good." "I told you I made it," I repeated, my voice a little firmer this time. I pointed to the classroom number on my schedule. "I'm in culinary arts with Mr. Dubois." Jessica and Brittany exchanged a look, a silent, mocking conversation passing between them in a fraction of a second. Then they both started to laugh. It wasn't a loud laugh, but a quiet, condescending chuckle that was somehow worse. "No, you didn't," Jessica said, her smile widening. "No, you did not." They just stood there, repeating it like a mantra, their laughter growing a little louder each time. My face started to burn with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Why couldn't they just believe me? Why did they have to try and tear down this one thing I was proud of? I decided to ignore them. They were just being morons. I turned my attention to the worksheet Mr. Harrison had put on the overhead projector, trying to tune out their whispers and giggles. I thought if I just refused to engage, they would get bored and go back to their own desks. I was wrong. The problem wasn't just that they didn't believe me. The problem was that they saw something that was mine, something I had created, and they decided they wanted it. They were my nemesis, not because of some grand rivalry, but because of their casual, entitled cruelty. They saw my small piece of happiness and decided it should be theirs, and my dissatisfaction with the world suddenly became a laser-focused beam of resentment aimed directly at them. My world was no longer just about pine trees and my grandmother's recipes. It was about the injustice brewing in the back of a stuffy history classroom. I tried my best to solve the problem by ignoring it. In my 16 years of life, I had learned that giving bullies the attention they craved was like pouring gasoline on a fire. So I stared intently at my worksheet, pretending to be absorbed by questions about the Gilded Age. I could feel their eyes on me, could hear their stifled giggles, but I was determined to be a stone wall. I figured they'd eventually lose interest and go back to scrolling through their phones. But Jessica and Brittany operated on a different level of audacity. My silence wasn't a deterrent, it was an invitation. I felt a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I looked up just in time to see Jessica's hand dart out. Before I could even process what was happening, she had snatched the plate of focaccia from my desk. She didn't say a word. She just grabbed it, turned, and started walking back to her seat with a triumphant smirk, as if she had just picked up a free sample at the mall. For a second, I was frozen in shock. Did that really just happen? In the middle of class, the sheer nerve of it was staggering. Then a hot wave of anger washed over me so intense it made my hands shake. That wasn't just bread, it was my grandmother's recipe. It was my time, my effort, my pride. A switch flipped inside me. The quiet, keep-to-myself Maya was gone. I shot out of my seat and lunged after her, catching her by the forearm just as she was about to sit down. "What the hell are you doing?" I hissed, my grip tight. "Let go of my food." Jessica's face twisted from a smug smirk into a mask of theatrical shock, as if I were the one who had done something outrageous. "Let go of my arm," she snapped, her voice loud enough to make a few other students look up from their work. "Give me back my food," I said through clenched teeth, my voice low and dangerous. I wasn't letting go, not a chance. "I said let go of me," she shrieked, trying to wrench her arm away. This was when Brittany, her loyal sidekick, jumped into action. "Maya, let go of her right now," she yelled, her voice shrill and accusatory. "You're crazy." The situation was escalating fast. It was a bizarre tug-of-war. I was holding onto Jessica's arm, she was holding onto my plate of focaccia, and Brittany was playing the role of a shrieking Greek chorus. Mr. Harrison, our teacher, finally glanced up from his desk at the front of the room, peered over his glasses, and said in a monotone voice, "Ladies, let's keep it down," before immediately going back to grading papers. He was useless. This only emboldened them. Jessica gave a final, violent yank and pulled her arm free from my grasp. She stumbled back a step, then shot me a look of pure hatred before scurrying to her desk and plopping down next to Brittany. She had won the first battle. She still had my food, but I wasn't giving up. I followed them, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood over their desks, a storm cloud of fury in a classroom that was now pretending extra hard to be interested in American history. "Give it back to me. Now," I demanded. By the time I got there, it was too late. They had already ripped off the plastic wrap. Jessica, with a look of defiant glee, broke off a large corner of the focaccia, the very corner that had a perfectly roasted cherry tomato flower on it. She took a huge bite, chewing with her mouth open while staring directly into my eyes. Brittany did the same, tearing off a piece for herself. They set the mutilated bread down on the desk between them, and then, as if to add the ultimate insult, they both picked up their phones and started scrolling, completely dismissing me as if I wasn't even there. The air left my lungs. It was one of the most profoundly disrespectful things I had ever experienced. They hadn't just stolen my food, they had defiled it, consumed my hard work right in front of me, and then treated me like I was invisible. I felt a profound sense of helplessness. I had tried to stop them physically, and I had failed. I had tried to demand it back verbally, and they had ignored me. My initial problem, their disbelief and mockery, had now mushroomed into a full-blown public humiliation. I was standing there, defeated, while they literally ate the fruits of my labor. The other students were watching now, a mix of pity and morbid curiosity on their faces. I could feel my cheeks burning hot with shame. This was my lowest point. I had lost. I had stood up for myself and been utterly crushed. Every effort I had made had only made the situation worse. I was no longer just the quiet girl who liked to cook. I was the girl who got her food stolen and eaten in front of the whole class. All the progress I thought I had made in being more confident, in taking pride in my skills, felt like it had evaporated in that single, humiliating moment. I looked at the mangled remains of my grandmother's recipe sitting on their desk, and something inside me went cold and quiet. All may be lost, I thought. But the fight wasn't over. That cold, quiet feeling inside me wasn't defeat. It was the calm before a storm. I stood there for a moment longer, watching them chew my bread, my focaccia, my grandmother's legacy, and then toss the half-eaten remains onto the desk like it was garbage. That was the final straw. They hadn't just stolen and eaten it, they had disrespected it to its core. The shame that had been burning in my cheeks cooled and hardened into something else, pure, undiluted rage. I looked at Jessica and Brittany, scrolling on their phones with greasy fingers, completely oblivious to the fury they had ignited. A single thought echoed in my mind, all right. I turned without a word and walked back to my desk. I could feel their smugness radiating from across the room. They thought they had won. They thought I was slinking back in defeat. They were wrong. I reached my desk, but I didn't sit down. I just stood there for a beat, letting the plan form, letting the decision solidify. I was no longer thinking about getting in trouble, about what Mr. Harrison would say, or what my parents would think. All I could think about was wiping those self-satisfied looks off their faces. I walked back toward them, my steps deliberate and silent. They didn't even look up from their phones until I was standing right over them again. Jessica glanced up, her mouth forming an irritated, "What now?" But the words never came out. I leaned down, snatched the paper plate with the sad, mangled remnants of my bread, and turned toward the classroom trash can. They both yelped in protest, "Hey!" and started to get up, trying to grab it back, but I was faster. I peeled off the rest of the plastic wrap, scraped the last of my beautiful focaccia into the garbage with a loud, definitive thud, and then, holding the empty paper plate, I walked out of the classroom. I didn't ask for permission. I just left. I walked the long, empty hallway back to the culinary arts room. The school was quiet during class time, and my footsteps echoed unnaturally. I pushed open the door to Mr. Dubois' room. He was sitting at his desk, and he looked up in surprise. I just walked over to the sink, rinsed the paper plate clean of its crumbs and oily residue, dried it, and placed it back on the stack where it belonged. I didn't say a word to him. I just nodded and walked back out. The walk back to history class felt like a mile. With every step, my resolve hardened. They had taken something from me, something personal. They had tried to humiliate me. Now I was going to give them something back, something just as personal and just as humiliating. I pushed open the door to Mr. Harrison's room and walked in. All eyes were on me. Jessica and Brittany were whispering furiously, shooting me venomous looks. I ignored them. I walked straight over to their desks, my face a blank mask. Jessica looked up at me, ready to spit some insult. And that's when I did it. I gathered up all the saliva I could muster in my mouth. I leaned in close to her face, so close I could see the tiny flecks of mascara on her eyelashes, and I spit directly into her perfectly made-up face. A thick glob of it landed right on her cheek and started to slowly drip down toward her chin. Her face froze in a state of absolute, abject shock. Before she could even scream, I turned my head and did the exact same thing to Brittany. It landed on her forehead, right between her eyes. For a perfect, silent second, nothing happened. The entire class was frozen, jaws agape. Then the explosion came. Both girls erupted at once, a volcanic screech of rage and disgust. "Oh my God," Jessica shrieked, scrambling to wipe my spit off her face with the back of her hand. "You are disgusting, I'm going to kill you." Brittany was crying and cursing, a string of swear words I didn't even know she knew. They were on their feet, pointing, screaming, their faces contorted in pure fury. And what did I do? I acted the way they did. I gave them nothing. I turned my back on their hysterics, walked calmly to my desk, sat down, picked up my pencil, and went back to my worksheet on the Gilded Age as if absolutely nothing had happened. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a drum solo, but on the outside I was a statue. I had taken back the power. I had flipped the script. They had tried to humiliate me with nonchalance, and I had returned the favor tenfold. Their rage washed over me, but it couldn't touch me. They screamed for Mr. Harrison, who was now awake and looking horrified. They demanded he do something. They were a whirlwind of righteous indignation, but it was too late. The damage was done. They stormed out of the classroom, shouting that they were going to the principal's office, and I just sat there, circling an answer about railroad monopolies, feeling a strange and terrible sense of satisfaction. My final, last-ditch effort wasn't about getting my food back. It was about getting my dignity back. And in that moment, spitting in their faces felt like the most profound victory of my life. The next scene unfolded exactly as you'd expect. I was called down to the principal's office. The office of Ms. Albright was exactly as intimidating as it was designed to be, with dark wood paneling and a big, imposing desk. Jessica and Brittany were already there, sitting in plush chairs, putting on a masterful performance. Tears were streaming down their faces, their voices trembling as they recounted my unprovoked and psychotic attack. I was the monster. They were the innocent victims who had just been sharing a snack. I sat quietly and waited for my turn. When Ms. Albright finally looked at me, her face was a stony mask of disapproval. I told her my side of the story calmly and factually. I told her about my grandmother's recipe, about how they mocked me, how Jessica stole the plate right off my desk, how I tried to get it back, and how they ate it in front of me just to be cruel. Ms. Albright listened, tapping a pen on her desk. The final judgment was swift and, in my opinion, wildly unjust. Jessica and Brittany, for the act of theft and bullying, received a stern talking to about sharing and being respectful of others' property. That was it. Me, for grabbing Jessica's arm, and for the spitting incident, I was given a 2-day in-school suspension. I could live with that. It was the price of my revenge, and I was willing to pay it. But then, Ms. Albright leaned forward, her voice dripping with condescending psychobabble. "Maya," she said, "I want you to understand the seriousness of grabbing a girl by the arm. You could have traumatized Jessica. Women experience things like that in the real world, and for her to have that happen in a place she should feel safe, it's just not acceptable." I stared at her, dumbfounded. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of her statement knocked the air out of me. All my rage, which had been simmering peacefully, came rushing back to the surface. "Excuse me," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "So let me get this straight. I could have traumatized her by grabbing her arm to stop her from stealing from me. It's about the principle of the thing, Maya," she said, completely missing the irony. "We do not put our hands on other students." That's when I snapped. The final bit of my self-control frayed and broke. So if Jessica doesn't want to be traumatized by someone grabbing her arm, maybe she shouldn't go around stealing things from people, I asked, my voice rising. Isn't that the more logical lesson here? Or is that logic just? Are you retarded? Is your logic retarded? The word hung in the air, electric and final. Ms. Albright's face went from stony to thunderous. "That will be 4 days of out-of-school suspension, Miss Ingram. You can go wait outside for your parents." As my dad drove me home a little while later, the Oregon rain started to fall, washing the world clean. He was quiet for a long time. I thought he was going to be furious. Finally, he looked over at me, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "4 days, huh?" he said. "You really shouldn't have called her that, Maya." He paused. "But those girls had it coming. Don't tell your mother I said that." In that moment, I didn't care about the 4-day suspension. I didn't care about what Ms. Albright thought. I had stood up for myself. I had taken back what was mine, not the bread, but my self-respect. I felt a deep, satisfying calm settle over me. When I finally returned to school the following week, something had changed. Jessica and Brittany wouldn't even look at me. They would see me in the hallway and immediately change direction. The power they held over the social scene had been cracked. People had seen them for what they were, common thieves who cried to the principal when their victim fought back. A few kids gave me quiet nods of respect in the hallway. I was no longer an easy target. But the best part, the real twist, came a few days later. Mr. Dubois, my culinary arts teacher, asked me to stay after class. I was worried he was going to reprimand me for the incident. Instead, he had a flyer in his hand for the Oregon State Youth Baking Championship. He told me he'd heard what happened, and while he didn't approve of the spitting, he was impressed that I had stood up for my work with such passion. He said that passion was what made a great chef. He told me he had already filled out the entry form for me. All I had to do was sign it. The thing they tried to steal from me, the symbol of my humiliation, had become the catalyst for the biggest opportunity of my life. My new normal wasn't just about not being bullied anymore. It was about channeling that fire they had ignited into something bigger and better, something they could never touch. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that the first thing I would bake for the competition would be my grandmother's focaccia art bread.